Thank you all for joining us today. We're just giving folks a few minutes to get logged in and we will get started shortly. We're just letting folks log in. Thank you all for joining us today. Just allow another minute or so for folks to join us. Thank you all for joining us today. I will now turn it over to ASH Executive Director, Laurent Hubert.
Thank you, Megan. And I want to welcome everyone to this webinar today on tobacco control advocacy at CEDAW, past, present, and future, which is part of a series about how to use human rights arguments as well as human rights mechanisms to advance tobacco control. And in this case today, we will focus on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, a UN treaty that has been joined by 189 parties, so it's legally binding for those parties. And just to point out, the US has not ratified, but did sign it in 1980. You will also hear about the work of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is the body of 23 independent experts that monitors the implementation of this treaty. And we're very fortunate that actually we have among us today on this webinar in the audience a member of this committee, and we will give her an opportunity to also say a few words. And also, by the way, this person, Rangita da Silva, was a pioneer in using a human rights-based approach for tobacco control. So we're very, very fortunate and happy to have her here today. You will also hear how to use reporting obligations that countries have to report on the implementation of CEDAW to ensure that tobacco is addressed through the submissions of tobacco-centric reports when countries are due to report, and also then I can help the committee to make recommendations on tobacco. And this is important because a number of countries and UN agencies really, like for example, the UN Development Program, have expressed alarm about the increase in tobacco use among girls and women. And the WHO, the European region for WHO, released a report not that long ago that expressed concern that in the European region, tobacco targets and tobacco reduction targets will be met for men, but not for women. So something that's rather worrisome. So today you will hear about 4 speakers who are on the agenda, and also we will give the floor to Rangita da Silva, a member of the CEDAW committee, and they will present about their experiences about how to use this human rights treaties like CEDAW to protect women and girls from tobacco. And it will be followed by a Q&A session. So for the Q&A session, please use the icon at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A, and use that to address the questions that you can address them to any of the panelists. You can send those questions at any time. So I will open up for the first speaker, who unfortunately just it was not able to join, so it's a short recorded presentation. Liz Hagen from Canada will present the experience in the process of preparing a report for Canada on CEDAW and tobacco issues that prevent the full realization of women's rights in Canada. Megan, if you could get that started. Thank you.
It looks like my connection is having an issue. Just give me 1 second.
Should we just go to the next speaker to have Emmanuelle in this case while this gets solved? In order to smooth out the process, why don't we have the second speaker?
I have it here. Just give me 1 second. Yep, just give me 1 second.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Laurent and Kelsey for their great team and their outstanding leadership on the human rights file, including CEDAW. ASH Canada was delighted to be a part of this important initiative, and we submitted a national report prior to the CEDAW summit last month. I'm going to review some of the elements of our report and provide some national context on this important issue. Canada has made positive strides in reducing gender inequities relating to tobacco use. However, a number of challenges remain, and I'll be sharing the good news and bad news. Let's start with the numbers. Smoking rates among women and men have been declining steadily since the 1960s in Canada. However, the gap between women and men has closed significantly over the years, due in part to aggressive industry marketing. Fortunately, the gap has not closed completely, and overall smoking rates among women remain 2 to 3 percentage.
Sounds like we're having a technical problem.
Yeah, it's saying that my internet is not strong enough. So, yeah, do you want to hop to the next person and I'll work on that?
So we'll do that. So if it's okay, Emmanuelle Beguinot with the Comité National Contre le Tabagisme, CNCT, will present the material from the French report, a French report that was submitted last year to CEDAW. So while we arrange this technical glitch. So Emmanuelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Is it okay for you? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you again. I'm very happy to be with you for this webinar. And as said, I'm going to speak about human rights and tobacco, and especially the French CEDAW report. And as I said, I work for the French National Committee for Tobacco Control, but I would like to associate to this presentation ASH and also the organization ACT. But first of all, a few words regarding the background of France and human rights. We can say that we have a very high level of legal protection in the country, especially thanks to texts such as the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen adopted in 1789, and we have other rights which were included after that. And all these rights are included in our constitution, what we call the bloc de constitutionnalité. And we have the Constitutional Council, which is in charge to protect, to like a watchdog, to be aware that these rights are preserved and protected. Besides this, France ratified a different convention regarding human rights. For example, at the European level, we have the European Convention for Human Rights, and at the international level, among other conventions, we ratified the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. However, when we see this topic, human rights and tobacco, until recently the topic was above all a matter promoted by the tobacco industry, we see an evolution since for some years, during the last years, thanks to three factors. The first one was we have an evolution of our legislation regarding the ban of patronage and all CSR communication, all corporate social activities are nowadays prohibited, and therefore it's not possible for the tobacco industry to financially support women organizations nowadays. Secondly, the involvement of ASH is particularly important and supportive for us, and thanks to decision adopted at the COP of the FCTC treaty, we can have basis for our work as well. And thirdly, we have the opportunity to include the dimension of human rights in a project supported financially by the French Front de lutte contre les addictions. And the organization ACT was financially financed for this activity and asked the CNCT to do this topic, this work. That's why we made a report.
I just noticed if you could maybe put your slides on presentation mode, so it'll be a little bigger.
Okay.
And if you can turn your camera on if you wish also.
Okay, just a second.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
So we prepared a report for the CEDAW convention. It was in French, but we translated it in English, and it was about the situation of smoking among women in 2022 in France. And I'm going to explain how we built this report. First of all, we proposed an overview of the current situation regarding tobacco and women with two main messages. The first message was to show that the current situation is highly problematic. Why? Because the smoking prevalence remains particularly high among women. They are exposed to passive smoking. The health consequences are more and more important, and it is not only health consequences, but also social consequences. So that was the first part and the first message regarding the current situation in the country. The second message was to explain that this problematic situation is due to the part played by the tobacco industry, because this tobacco industry is at the origin of the women tobacco epidemic, because this industry constantly uses the conquest of women's rights in its approach. And we made some researchers at the beginning of 2010s, and we found many organizations which were financially supported by different tobacco manufacturers, especially Philip Morris. And the tobacco manufacturers also developed specific marketing strategies to target women with new products, with specific advertising, with the manipulation of products. We can think, for example, the light scandal, but also the filter gas scandal. And constantly, the tobacco industry was opposed to any tobacco control measures, which would have decreased the consumption, especially among women. And they were not only opposed to this measure, but once these measures were adopted, they always tried to circumvent and even violate these tobacco control provisions. And we have many convictions regarding illicit advertising targeting specific women. So that was the first part. The second part was to explain how this situation is violation of women's rights and France's international commitments to different conventions, of course, the CEDAW Convention, but also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Convention on the Rights of the Child, also concerning the Sustainable Development Goals, on more globally our goal regarding also our objective for non-communicable diseases, and of course the FCTC provisions. In a third part, we proposed an analysis regarding the situation about what was already adopted regarding tobacco control, legislation and provision. The idea was to highlight when positive measures had been adopted, to show that when we adopt positive and strong provisions, we can have results. But at the same time, it was also the opportunity to underline when various protective provisions are still insufficiently respected or implemented. And it was the opportunity, of course, to show the necessity also to apply, to adapt as well, and strengthen provisions. And that's why this document had to identify where French public authority absolutely need to tackle identified problems. And in the last part, we had recommendation mainly in 3 directions. First, to improve, monitor, and improve the effectiveness of certain measures, especially regarding some provision of the FCTC treaty. I mean, particularly Article 16 about the sale by to minors, but also 13 about marketing, and also 14 about cessation and a specific approach for women. We also recommended to complete the current protective mechanism to deal with the targeting of women by tobacco companies, and especially to explain how things are moving, are changing due to the new tobacco and nicotine products and the new strategy developed by the tobacco industry, especially regarding the instrumentalization of harm reduction, which is particularly targeted to women. And last, we also recommend to pursue a general tobacco control strategy, including a campaign focused on smoking among women, and in the more global framework of the preparation of a tobacco-free generation, which has been decided by public authorities and which is supposed to be reached by 2032. So when the report was finished, we decided to disseminate it in 2033 with other initiatives in the framework of this project about human rights. And we particularly use this document as a tool for education and communication. There were also other initiatives, as said, for example, the organization ACT developed communication campaign for women. They insisted also about human rights in communication for children. A workshop was also organized for capacity building in 2022, gathering people from ASH, ACT, and CNCT, and with presence of Stephen Marks, a professor specialized of health and human rights. And he trained us and other representatives of health NGO about this topic more particularly. We also propose a scientific publication on the topic. And lastly, we developed a common communication when the report was disseminated, when there was the CEDAW committee at the international level. And here is some example of the communication which was disseminated on social networks. Here again. And beyond the CEDAW report, we decided also to continue to keep this topic in our strategy and to include human rights in our approach at different levels. We continue at the level of education and communication to continue to raise awareness and to keep the topic at the agenda. That's why we regularly make a review of the literature, not only scientific, but also the gray literature, but we also particularly visit the ASH website because we have many documents on this website. We translated some key documents in French, and there are some documents which are available on our website. We carry out also syntheses about that topic. And particularly, we try to follow up this thematic and we continue regularly to write articles on this topic, tobacco and human rights, on the information platform Génération Sans Tabac. And here is a link where you can find different articles regularly, which has posted on this platform. It's in French, but nowadays you can see this article also in English. We also continue to have an advocacy and to promote recommendation regarding this topic. And we particularly recommend to communicate within the framework of national and international coalition on this issue. And we try to decipher the tobacco industry's misuse of the human rights term. And we also integrate the defense of human rights into various tobacco control measures, in particular, of course, in most of the FCTC articles. And at the level of France and the European Union, we consider that we have to play a leading role in this area, in particularly at the level of the COP, of the FCTC, but also when we have the different cycles of international convention on human rights, and also in the public policies which are defined as the European Union. I mean here the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And last, of course, in our public policy at national level, which have to include this dimension. At a very concrete level, we particularly included this topic in our advocacy to exclude the tobacco industry from the label ESR. ESR, that's Sustainable Investment. That's a label which has been decided by the French heads of French state, budget state. We also have legal actions at our level of organization since the 90s. Through this legal action, we try to build a strong jurisprudence protecting public health and also here human rights. And our purpose is here through these legal actions is to include this notion of human rights in the reasoning of judges. Of course, our main difficulty is that these agreements have no direct effect in criminal law. However, we try to include these agreements in the decision, and it would be a first step for us in the process to include this approach. And just as an example, in a very recent case, which was played a fortnight ago, we included human rights in the case regarding a ban to a minor. It was at the Court of Appeal of Paris. Right. And as you can see in our conclusion, we included this dimension of human rights to justify condemnation and positive conviction. So to conclude, I would say that the CEDAW report was really an opportunity to include human rights in our tobacco control approach, enabling not only to improve tobacco control, but also to contribute to the respect of human rights, and also to include this dimension in the fight against commercial determinants of health. For sure, it remains quite a new topic for many tobacco control advocates in France and also for NGOs involved in human rights. That's why it requires time and quite a long-term approach. But however, we have resources nowadays to support this approach. And once again, as I said, you have many documents on the ASH website, on the platform I mentioned, Génération Sans Tabac, and this webinar also contribute to this training. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmanuelle, for this very comprehensive presentation on how to use a human rights-based approach to address tobacco and address some of the biggest challenges we have, because one of the biggest challenges we have at national level is lack of whole of government engagement. There's this self-criticism we do among ourselves that we tend to work in silos, and that's a great example of bringing up different communities and also using it for litigation, which you'll hear more from the other speakers. Because I'm conscious of time, instead of having the recorded presentation, I'll give priority to the live speakers. So I will have the next speakers, Nikitia Poole, with the Health Funds for Smoke-Free Netherlands, will present their plans for an upcoming report for the Netherlands. And this is so important because with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the Tobacco Treaty, unfortunately, doesn't have a very good process for civil society to engage in the reporting processes and to monitoring compliance at national level. Something that we can do through the use of the reporting processes with treaties like CEDAW. So Nikitia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just want to check you're seeing the correct version, not the presenter view.
It's a correct version.
Yeah.
And
excellent.
So we are in the presenter view because there's the notes on this side.
Oh, you are? Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
let me swap it around.
Yeah.
See if I can. swap that here. Yes, hopefully that's sorted it.
Yes, perfect.
Yes,
Thank you.
excellent. Yeah, it's always tricky with two screens. Right, yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Nikitia Poole, and I work at the Health Fund for Smoke-Free Netherlands. And so I'm going to sort of run through a little bit of the highlights of our report, starting with the present situation and then looking a little bit at the past and then finishing on the future. For those who may have been at the the ENSP European Conference on Tobacco Control lately, you may have seen a presentation from my colleague about the situation in the Netherlands entitled now Tobacco Control, the Netherlands, a success story under threat. So I'll be going into that a little bit. But to start off with the present situation, now we see a decline in the trend for smoking over the last few years, which is obviously good to see. And general smoking prevalence now sits around 19%. And for women, we see now we've got smoking at 15.4% and daily smoking at 11.1%. Now I say it has been declining over the last few years, but in the most recent years, so last year and this, we're starting to see it stagnate, and hopefully that won't also, if we look at the data next year, result in a slight increase. So that's something we're keeping a good eye on. But smoking, of course, isn't just a problem for adults over the age of 18. In the Netherlands, at least, we know that 2/3 of smokers begin smoking before their 18th birthday. There's estimated that up to 75 children become addicted to tobacco every day. And we know, of course, that children are extra sensitive for addiction to nicotine. So if you look at the situation among children at the moment, and then specifically looking at girls in this situation, we see that 17.3% have ever smoked cigarettes, with 9.4% in the last month and 2% doing so daily. You may also notice that for the ever smoking and smoking in the past month, that more girls than boys do so. Something else that is very much a concern for us is vaping in the Netherlands. That has grown quite considerably over the last few years, especially among young people. And here we see again, now the prevalence of vaping is even higher than for smoking among children. And again, we see that the rates are higher among girls than for boys. With somewhat alarming 28.1% of girls saying they've ever vaped, with nearly 5% vaping daily. And what we also know from a slightly different sample of those aged 12 to 25, so still very young people, is that 7 in 10 of them of the vape are also smoking cigarettes. So they're actually doing both. And there are sort of increasing signals that dual use of vapes and cigarettes could be even worse for our health. So despite a ban on e-cigarette flavors that was implemented and came into force this year, e-cigarettes still remain widely available to young people, particularly through social media and on the school playground. And of course, there's also increasing evidence of the heavy metals that can be found, that you can be exposed to when using them. So this is something that is definitely a growing concern. And so just briefly over the health risks, in particular for women associated with smoking, we all know that there's an increased risk of various cancers, particularly lung cancer and cardiovascular disease. But of course, there are health risks that are applicable to women alone. And with this, we're talking about a increased risk of cervical abnormalities, altered menstrual function, and potentially worsened reproductive outcomes. For postmenopausal women, we're also looking at lower bone density. So these are quite some important health risks, specifically for women. And then when we also look at women who want to quit smoking, oftentimes they have a lot more difficulty to do so, or at least a lot more difficulty in maintaining that period of absence if they have been able to quit. And then looking more specifically at pregnancy and child health, in the Netherlands, roughly 8% of women smoke during pregnancy, with 14% beforehand, and this rises back up to 10% after pregnancy. But we also see quite a high rate of relapse, with nearly 6 in 10 relapsing within 4 weeks of stopping if they try to stop during pregnancy. And of course, that also brings risks along with it for the child, unborn child. For instance, increased risk of being premature or stillborn, and higher chances of low birth weight and congenital defects. And so there are also, we have short-term risks and long-term risks. So in the short term, like I say, the low birth weight and problems with fetal growth, but in the long term, also risks for asthma, overweight, ADHD, impaired brain development, eye problems, and the list goes on really. So now looking at the past, this is where the success story part of the Netherlands story comes in, I think. We've been implementing quite a few measures over the last few years, and that is very much now in the frame of a smoke-free generation, rookvrije generatie, we call it. And so we've not been focusing as much on the human rights component, but more so the rights of children to be able to grow up smoke-free, where they don't see it anymore, where they're not exposed to it anymore, and that of course that they don't go and start to smoke themselves. And as part of this, we have the target that by 2040, 5% of adults will smoke, and 0% of pregnant women and 0% of children. So this all started in the run-up to 2018, this whole movement, with the conclusion of the National Prevention Agreement, which was signed by many different civil organizations and included measures for alcohol and obesity, but also for smoking, and a whole host of measures that were to be implemented over the next few years. And I'll just pick out a few of them because it's quite a lot that are perhaps.
We lost the sound here for a second, Nikita.
Implement in all of our shops. There was a slight exception made for tobacco specialty shops where you can't see anything from the outside, but once you step into the shop, you can see the products. But for everywhere else, you can't see any of the products anymore. They're behind closed doors. And then also following on from that, there was a smoking ban introduced in outdoor school premises. And we're constantly looking for ways to extend smoking bans to other areas, either through legislation or through voluntary actions, for instance, at sports clubs and at cafe terraces. That's a real movement in the Netherlands at the moment. And then moving forward to more present time, because there's been various measures have been implemented in the meantime. What I wanted to highlight was the ban on e-cigarette flavors, which has the exception of tobacco flavors that came into force this year. But as I mentioned, it's still pretty easy for children to be able to acquire e-cigarettes with flavors through the illegal market. And that's something we're hoping to work on in the coming year, really, to improve the enforcement of that. And then lastly, quite a significant measure was introduced, the ban of sale of tobacco products in supermarkets. And that is part of a phasing out of the types of places that can sell tobacco. So starting with the supermarkets and then moving on to it only becoming available in convenience shops and specialty shops by 2030. And then lastly, only being available in tobacco specialty shops by 2032. Other important legislation in this period is that all nicotine products, so also products like snus, and all the various new inventions from in relation to the IQOS and other heated tobacco products and other nicotine products will all be considered under the Tobacco Act from next year. So all of the display requirements, promotion requirements, packaging requirements, I believe should be applicable for these as well. Perhaps not all the packaging requirements, but definitely the display and promotion. And so with all of this in mind, the Netherlands, from the 2019 tobacco control scale report, we sat at 14th position. And in the most recent one, 2021, we rose to the 4th position. So to reflect these good developments. So briefly about the legal obligations, I mentioned the human rights frame isn't one we use really very much at the moment. We're very much focused on, like I said, that smoke-free generation, the right of children to grow up smoke-free. But we are of course party to the CEDAW, and we have of course also ratified the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And so from both of these, it follows that the Netherlands has a legal obligation to take appropriate measures to ensure that the full development and advancement of women and girls is not hampered by the use of tobacco and related products. And then to our recommendations in our report. Obviously, we've introduced a fantastic range of measures so far, but now there's still a long way to go, and we see that as well with the smoking prevalence starting to stagnate. So one thing that we find quite important is ensuring that taxes on tobacco products increase annually by at least 10%, and are also corrected for inflation. Alongside that, we'd also like there to be taxation of e-cigarettes. We don't have that at the moment. There needs to be more structural mass media campaigns about smoking and vaping. I believe next year there will finally be a campaign on vaping. What exactly that will entail is yet to be seen, but that's a nice first step. As I mentioned, we have that scaling, that sort of phasing out of the for the different points of sale. We'd like to see that happen a lot faster. It can happen a lot faster. But also to look at increasing the legal age of sale. One chance we see at the moment, there's going to be a debate in December on a citizen initiative, which more than 40,000 people have signed within, and included in that is a generational ban on the sale of tobacco and nicotine products. So either looking at raising the age to 21 or a generational ban is something we're lobbying for at the moment. But of course, all of this has to go in hand with improving access to smoking cessation aids. And currently, you're entitled to have one attempt per year reimbursed by your health insurance. But in 2 years' time, that will be so that you can repeatedly make use of smoking cessation support. So it's also a nice development. And then, as I mentioned, extending the smoking ban to other places where children often visit, and preferably also just other places in general, so that it's seen as a lot less normal. And then lastly, in the report, we mentioned more about the environmental impact, a ban on all cigarette filters. Now, in terms of the threats I mentioned, obviously we have the stagnating smoking prevalence, but we also have a new government, more of a right-wing government that sees this very much as an individual responsibility issue rather than a collective issue or even a human rights issue. So there's some challenges there, definitely, in trying to get some of these proposals made into legislation. One chance we do see with them is the enforcement side of things. That is a bit of an issue, especially with e-cigarettes, as I mentioned, and that is something they're open to listening to. So that's something we're going to be working on in the coming years, I think. And that was that was the situation from the Netherlands. So thank you very much.
Thank you for this very detailed presentation on the Netherlands situation. And I'm sure there will be questions, especially on, as you mentioned, also the TFG proposal in tobacco-free generation proposal in the Netherlands. And I wonder how human rights-based approach or arguments will be used to advance this. We'll go to the next speaker, Kelsey Romeo-Stuppy, who's ASH managing attorney. And she will address some of the work we've been doing around the committee on the committee that works with the CEDAW committee, and a briefing we just had very recently with them, with the members of the committee, and how we can get them to further address tobacco and make very specific recommendations to countries on how to address tobacco and to protect the rights of women and girls. So, Kelsey, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Laurent. Please excuse my voice. I have a cold. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me okay. My presentation is on CEDAW's role in furthering tobacco control. As Laurent just mentioned, we are just coming off a CEDAW session where we did what we're calling a blast. We've submitted 4 reports from 4 different countries and also had a side event encouraging the committee to consider tobacco. So I'm going to talk about that a lot throughout my presentation, but I wanted just to mention it as sort of a context. That's why we're having this webinar right now, is because we just had this big experience with CEDAW. So that's sort of the present in our past, present, and future. France was the report that was in our past, the Netherlands was the report that's in our future, and the CEDAW blast is our present. So I always like to start a presentation with sort of the why. Tobacco use among women is decreasing significantly lower rate than men. And in some countries, women are smoking more. Emmanuelle went through some of the French example, but they're a country where there's been an increase in smoking among women. This is also true in countries around the world where women's liberation is more recent. It's more common that women are smoking more. So how do we, as advocates, counter big tobacco by utilizing human rights arguments? One of our tools is the international community. So for this purpose of this discussion, we're talking about the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The committee is the body that governs the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is one of the biggest human rights treaties in the world. It's been very ratified, and many, many countries are obligated to it. The United States is not one of them, but most countries around the world are. One way we as advocates can influence the committee is by submitting reports when our countries or countries we work with are due to report, which is about every 5 years. So this year we submitted for Chile, Japan, New Zealand, and Canada. And at ASH Canada's presentation, the video of Les was going to talk a little bit about their contribution. I think we'll be able to link that up for you, so you'll be able to watch it after if we can't get it played today. We also work to influence the committee by working on guidance for the committee. So the CEDAW committee is a group of independent appointed experts. There's a lot of law professors on the committee, but that's not all of who it is. And they are influenced in various ways, and they're influencing them is important because they get to decide what questions to ask the countries. So one way we've succeeded in influencing them was we got a point on tobacco inserted into this document that's on my screen, which is NGO guidance for national parallel reports. So this is the guidance that the NGO committee is giving to governments on what they should put in their report. We have also worked to influence the CEDAW list of questions that goes to the committee members. So far, we've not been successful there, but next time they open it, we will try again. And we keep the lines of conversation open with those kinds of groups and committees. I mentioned earlier that the United States is not obligated to CEDAW. It's not signed and ratified CEDAW. So one of the exciting campaigns that can help is called Cities for CEDAW, which is run by a fantastic colleague of ours, Yoon, and she and her colleagues encourage cities and localities around the country to adopt the rules of CEDAW, sort of a symbolic ratification. Sometimes it goes beyond symbolic and they actually incorporate the laws that are set out in CEDAW into local law. So that's something that could be considered for states, localities, towns, etc., as a way to move forward with this as well. And as I think seen a lot of traction and is growing in an exciting way to incorporate international law into a more local manner. So what's CEDAW's role in furthering tobacco control? We've talked about how what we can do as advocates, but what can they do? Tobacco violates numerous human rights. We say it a lot. If you're on this webinar, you've probably heard me say it before, but particularly the right to health. CEDAW contains the right to health. So CEDAW is obligated to protect the right to health of women and girls. And they can do that by protecting people from the tobacco industry. A study by our colleague Carolyn Dressler and others, including Harry Landau, have shown that human rights bodies are 4 times more likely to mention tobacco when they've received a report on tobacco. So we can't expect the committee to ask governments on their own. It's a lot more likely to happen if the tobacco control community has submitted a report in advance. So we need to show up and be there because the committee is open to the idea. They just need a little help getting there. The influence of the committee can be really, really strong. One really exciting outcome from CEDAW was several years back, a report was submitted when Argentina came up in front of the committee. For those of you that don't know, we have a tobacco treaty. It's called the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And again, almost every country in the world, or many, many countries in the world, have ratified. And again, the United States is not one of them. But another one that has not ratified it is Argentina. So when Argentina came up before CEDAW, a group of NGOs submitted a report asking the committee to ask the government of Argentina to ratify the FCTC. So that's a really big deal. And it's hard to put into words even for people who aren't in international law. But for a committee that works on one treaty to recommend that a country ratify another treaty is just huge. That's a really big victory. So it's the committee put in their concluding observations to the government of Argentina that they urged them to ratify the FCTC. So that was a huge victory for advocates to get that in writing, that an international body believes that the Argentinian government should do that. And that's the sort of thing we're looking for. That's kind of the gold standard when we submit these reports, is to get a very clear, concrete observation from the committee. So I mentioned at the start of this that we just did our blast to CEDAW and had a side event. We were invited for an informal briefing with the CEDAW committee, which was very exciting. It was just our panelists and the experts on the CEDAW committee, as well as some staff. And it was fairly informal. It was an opportunity for us to present to them and them to ask questions of us. And we got some very interesting. We've been submitting these reports for a while without getting a lot of feedback. So it was fantastic to hear from the committee. One thing we learned was that they prefer their reports to relate to specific items in the convention. So they want us to connect it to a specific issue of the CEDAW convention. So if we're referring to the right to education, they want us to link it to that specific paragraph in the convention. And that's helpful for them as they're working through. So that's really good information to know. Another thing we learned that we didn't know was that the committee assigns different committee members different subject matter areas. For example, Luxembourg is coming up for reporting in the next cycle. and we met the committee member who's responsible for reviewing health issues for that report. So we didn't know that, and now we can know that we need to find that specific person and try to advocate to them. And I think the most important takeaway for me was that they were very open and engaged in the idea of protecting women and girls from tobacco. They weren't bored or jaded or, over it. I thought they were very interested and willing to work with us to protect the right to health. So that was really exciting as well. I mentioned coming up in the next cycle. So these are the next 3 cycles. It's a little bit more complicated than this because there are also pre-sessional meetings. So this list would actually be doubled if I included the pre-sessional meetings. If anyone is interested, I'm more than happy to share the link where I got this information and you can look at it yourself. But these are the next ones that are upcoming. The Netherlands, unfortunately, has put together the report assuming that they were going to have a hearing in October, and it got pushed, which happens fairly frequently. And it didn't just get pushed to February, it got pushed to next October at the request of the government of the Netherlands. So that's the sort of thing, unfortunately, that happens a lot, and we just have to accept it and deal with it. But we're hoping to keep the reporting going through the next several cycles and ongoing. And we try to work with country partners in country for each partner that we report for. We don't want to write it for a country that we aren't familiar with. We want to work with locals. So if you're interested in participating in that, please feel free to send me a message. We'd love to talk about it, and we'd love to ensure that at least a couple countries per session are getting some tobacco attention. So those are the next coming, and we'll share the slides after. So you're welcome to look at this later. Other than reporting, there are a lot of other ways that we can influence the CEDAW committee and have them help further tobacco. From the committee, where they can just lay out an opinion and talk about how they believe their treaty is connected to the issue at hand. So we could request a general recommendation on tobacco. The other thing they can do is they can call on special rapporteurs who are individuals in the UN system to write reports or to include tobacco in the reports. And there are several that apply to CEDAW. So the special rapporteur for health, there's a special rapporteur on violence against women, which is not as relevant. But then there's some out-of-the-box ones that you might not expect, like development or housing or things like that. And then finally, individual advocacy by and to the committee members. The committee members are people, and they're influential people. So by talking to them, we have connections to a lot of other schools of public health, law schools, government agencies, NGOs, other people who have other ways to further tobacco control. And there might be other options that we haven't even considered yet. When we're working in a new area, there's always some exciting things that can come out of it, and some maybe we didn't even foresee. So with that, I want to say thank you for having me, and thanks for attending. And I'll hand it back to you, Laura.
Thank you, Kelsey. And we're very conscious of time, so we'll go straight to Q&A and concluding remarks from the panelists. And for the video from our colleague from Canada, that will be posted on our website along with the recording of the webinar. So my first question, I'll go by the order of the speakers. Emmanuelle, one of the challenges we saw, even with the committee, it was very interesting with the committee, the CEDAW committee, when we asked how many of you are familiar with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, I think only 2 or 3 raised their hands out of, there's 23 committee members. Most of them were not aware of it. And I remember the similar issue had happened in France, where if you go to the French Parliament, a lot of parliamentarians are not aware about the FCTC, but they are much more aware of CEDAW or the Framework Convention on Climate Change or some other UN treaties. So I was wondering, has that been helpful in the French advocacy in breaking silos and bringing raising more awareness about tobacco issues by bringing people who work in women's rights, for example? Has that been helpful, this work you've done with the CEDAW report?
Well, as I said, it's quite a long process. It contributes for sure to help, but it requires still time to have really important improvement regarding the situation. But I do think it contributes to raise awareness among these stakeholders as well. Yeah. I'm sorry, Laurent. Sometimes I can't hear you.
No, thank you. Yes, indeed. So it takes time, but by building that relationship with the human rights.
Exactly.
And I know in Germany, for example, with the report on the Convention on the Rights of the Child led to the committee making specific recommendations to Germany to do more to protect children's. So it's definitely an approach that does pay off in the long term. Nikita, I have a question for you. So you mentioned the tobacco-free generation concept, and there's this discussion about the phasing out of retail places. And one of the questions was from one of the attendees is, there was that at one point, so this discussion of, you mentioned a story with the convenience stores, but eventually maybe to have it only in tobacco shops only. But how do you see then a human rights-based approach to accelerate that work to phase out the commercialization of tobacco products?
Yeah, that's well, with the phasing, but also with the tobacco-free generation and the debate that's upcoming. One thing that we're trying to argue the point of is, for instance, obviously there's a lot of resistance for implementing these measures because with the current political parties, it's seen as an individual responsibility. So we're trying to really promote the idea that it is actually more of a liberal concept to enact these sorts of policies, because smoking is not exactly, it is an addiction, and the question of a free choice is well, definitely up for debate at the very least. So in terms of the human right to health, that is that sort of freedom discussion, that's something that we're taking into these conversations. And then something else with this tobacco-free generation, we're hoping that they'll also give us a legal basis for the government if they aren't reaching the targets they've set in the National Prevention Agreement, because at the moment, it's all well, nothing happens if they don't reach the target. So that's something else that we are trying to achieve.
Interesting point on the litigation. I think it's worth pointing out also that 9 out of 10 smokers, and I believe it's probably the same in the Netherlands, start smoking before they're 18. So they do so as children and before their frontal cortex is developed. So they become addicted before they can they can consent to certain behaviors. And one of the questions, and that's for Kelsey, was on the individual versus the corporation. So could you maybe clarify, in the context of a human rights setting, the obligations and responsibility of the state, or the government, corporations, to protect the rights of individuals? Because here, this is not about individual behavior, but it's about protecting the rights of individuals. Could you clarify that?
Yeah. So a human rights argument is about a government, not about a corporation. So when we're saying that a human right has been violated, it's the government that is failing to protect it. The corporation might be doing the action that is causing the violation, but the violation is the government. There's 3 parts to a human rights